To talk about that, Dr. Duncan Robertson joins me. He's a lecturer in Management Sciences and Analytics at Loughborough University. He's currently focusing on analysing policies related to the pandemic. Dr. Robertson, have you seen? Good evening. Have you seen anything that you approve of yet?
Well, I think as ever, we don't quite know what the government's policy is. I mean, obviously, various people are trying to brief one way or the other. But what we do have is experience of what's releasing the lockdown too early does. It produces an extra wave and potentially a further lockdown. So we have experience of releasing lockdowns too early, and hopefully we're not going to make the same mistake yet again.
Well, I wouldn't bet against it. March the 8th, is that too early?
Well, the problem is that, things have changed. Now, of course, we have this new variant, and we know that it's more transmissible. We've got some more information, and now it's confirmed that it's more severe. So the problem is that, of course, you can release things. I mean, you can do whatever you like. But the problem is you need to be able to calibrate your response and basically have to react to when things go wrong. So it'd be great. I mean, we all want the vaccines to work, the vaccines to go out to everyone to have second doses, the vaccines to be 100% effective. But the problem is what happens if it isn't. And the problem is if you do this sort of big bang, releasing everything at the same time, you don't know the dynamics, and therefore it's very difficult to get that genie back into the bottle.
Yeah, now, Boris Johnson has said that he's going to be guided by caution, which, I mean, he's tried everything else. Why not caution? Give that a bash. You say that this new variant is more serious. It's both more transmissible and it gives you a worse condition when you get it. That rather implies that we should wait until everybody gets a vaccine, no?
Well, I mean, of course, with all these things, there's this balance between people getting infected with disease and the economy. But I think what we've seen is that those two aren't really in conflict with each other. Once you get the disease down to a low level, then the economy can open up again and you don't have to go through these lockdown and release cycles. So, as I say, the problem is we just don't really know what's happening because there's a lot going on at the moment. In the early time period, you basically had a disease spreading, and there were lots of uncertainties about that, but the dynamics of how the disease spread were relatively straightforward. But the problem is now we've got vaccines, we've got people adhering to social distancing or not, how many people are taking the vaccine, what groups are actually being offered the vaccine. And of course, we've got this great milestone. It's absolutely fantastic. There's 15 million, but we still don't quite know who has actually got those vaccines. It would be nice if everybody in those groups 1 to 4 had actually received the vaccine, but we don't know. And of course, those top 4 groups, that's an artificial political distinction. The JCVI, talk about these groups 1 to 9, which covers 99% of vulnerable people. But of course, we seem to be stopping at, or at least releasing things once groups 1 to 4 have been released, and that covers 88% of deaths. But of course, that is if every single person in those each of those 4 cohorts, so care workers, healthcare workers, and clinically extremely vulnerable and over 70s have it. And we just don't have the data. So, there are 15 million in those categories, and 15 million people have received the first dose of the vaccine. But we don't know whether they're the right people, and that's going to be quite important going forward, whether people are actually getting the effect of the vaccine.
Yeah. But even with people that are younger than that, they're not immune, are they? Because I think the last week of January, under the age of 64, 1,000 people died in one week. I think under the age of 44, it was 100, which is a smaller number than the whole, but it's not nothing.
And that's exactly the point, that, we are, unfortunately getting a bit too used to the numbers of deaths per day. And these numbers of deaths are unacceptable, and that's of course why we're in lockdown at the moment, because they are just unacceptable. And of course, the health service is becoming, or was becoming, overwhelmed. But we shouldn't be calibrate our response to think 1,000 deaths per day is the normal, because it absolutely isn't the normal. And we have to think, actually, what is the acceptable number of deaths? And that's of course a very difficult thing to do. But the government is making those decisions, and hopefully we'll be able to answer the what is their expected number of deaths as a result of their policy. And if they don't know that number, then you have to wonder what's setting the policy.
And it's also true, isn't it, that you only get a certain amount of protection if you've had one jab, and even if you've had two, you have to wait sometimes up to 6 weeks for it to really kick in, which does imply that April's way too soon.
Well, I mean, absolutely. That the reason that people are getting one dose rather than two is that we basically have a very serious problem, and it would be great if everyone had the 2 doses, but there's a very sensible decision that's been made to vaccinate with a first dose more people, so more people have this partial effect. And it does take time for, as you say, from first to second dose, and then for that to take full effect. But what we expect to see is people have to have some benefits from these, the first dose. And it appears as though, you can wait up to about 3 months. But, these are still slightly unknowns. And what we also don't know is the effect of these variants and how effective vaccines are against specific variants. At the moment, we have, a number floating around. But the problem is, if we've got high levels of people mixing, then potentially we get new variants that could escape from these vaccines. And that's absolutely what we don't want to happen.
Now, when we do start to get let out, and it is interesting, isn't it, how popular the lockdowns actually poll. That something of the order of 80% of the population think that we should be in lockdown, and they fully support it. But I assume that when we get let out a little bit, isn't it quite likely that people will just go, oh, OK, that's over then, and we'll go back to doing what we used to do?
Well, it depends how the messaging happens. And, obviously the Health Secretary and the Prime Minister looked, pretty relieved, I think, today to have that 15 million first doses. But it's all to do with the messaging. If people think, well, this is, if the message comes in the number 10 press conferences next week that, yes, we've reached this milestone, we've succeeded, then people are going to say, well, OK, we've put up with this lockdown for a certain amount of time. Why should we put it up with it for longer if we've met those targets? But the point is that we just don't know what's going to happen next. We can make some projections and predictions, but it's very difficult, and therefore releasing everything at once means it's very difficult to close everything down at the same time. So, potentially we're in another lockdown cycle. And, everybody wants to get out of lockdowns and to have a normal life as soon as possible. But the point is it needs to be a sustainable normal, and we need to get back to, what we had before. So that's what we're aiming for.
There's a bit of push me, pull you with people's desires, isn't there? That we do want to get out, but now we seem to be so close to the end. It's almost the sort of feeling like you don't want to be the last person shot in a war, just moments before ceasefire.
No, absolutely. And, if you looked at, even 6 months ago, people were, when they were trying to think about what the end game of this was, it was still not really known that vaccines were going to be a way out. And what's, absolutely fantastic news is the number of vaccines that are licensed, but also are in the pipeline and can be updated. So we have the solution in terms of vaccination, certainly for the UK. Of course, how it spreads around the world is another thing, and how vaccines get distributed globally is another issue. But we do have vaccines, and, waiting a couple more weeks, a few more weeks, may have better long-term outcomes. And, releasing everything at once is definitely not a good way to go.
What about people coming into the country? I mean, we've come to this place really late, only about a year after some other countries have done it, but finally they seem to be not closing the border exactly, but putting some sort of checks and quarantine in place. Is that actually enough, or should we just be essentially building an invisible wall?
Well, the problem is at the moment we have very large numbers of cases in the UK, so it's not as though we're immune to getting new variants in the UK. And of course, the perhaps the dominant strain that's going to be around the world is the one that was at least first detected in the UK, the Kent variant. And so it's not necessarily just the battle of, keeping these, and that's one of the problems with when you start naming these variants is people think, well, it comes from South Africa, it comes from Brazil. And of course it doesn't. It may have been, that may be the first place it was detected. But, obviously we want some sort of, restriction of these variants coming into the country or, being created in this country. And, everything we can do is a good thing. But, of course, if we're just going to open up, we're going to get more transmission in the UK and therefore more variants in the UK. And, that importing variants becomes less effective.
And just finally, some scientists are saying that normality will be resumed this time next year. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think with all these things, you can't really predict too far in the future because, one of the things with these viruses is it's very difficult to know what's going to happen next. I don't think anyone was predicting the specific variants that are coming, but we just don't know. Things can surprise us, and that's why we have to be very cautious about how we release lockdown so that we're not surprised and we have an end point and get out of this as best we can.
Dr. Robertson, thanks so much for your time. That's Dr. Duncan Robertson, lecturer in Management Sciences and Analytics at Loughborough University.